Every parent's worst nightmare is watching their child suffer in silence. Some wounds run so deep they echo through generations, shaping the very fabric of who we become. In the quiet town of Millfield, Sheriff Cole Hayes has built his reputation on understanding people's pain rather than punishing their mistakes. His office door stays open for anyone carrying burdens too heavy to bear alone. On this evening, as shadows grow long across Main Street, 7-year-old Clara Morrison appears at his threshold. Her small voice trembles as she speaks of her fathers, drinking and the fear that fills their home. Cole expects to find another grieving man lost in his bottles. Instead, he discovers a secret that connects this broken family to his own forgotten dreams. But what truth could possibly tie Cole's heart to the very people he's sworn to protect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Sheriff Cole Hayes made his customary rounds through Millfield. At 52, he moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that rushing rarely solved anything worth solving. His weathered hands, more accustomed to offering comfort than drawing his weapon, adjusted the tarnished star pinned to his chest, a badge that had seen 15 years of service under his care. Millfield wasn't the town it used to be. Once a thriving hub where cattle drives met railroad lines, it now bore the quiet dignity of a place learning to age gracefully. The old courthouse still stood proud at the town's heart, its clock tower marking time for the handful of businesses that kept the community breathing. Henderson's General Store, Murphy's Saloon, and the First Bank of Millfield lined the dusty street like old friends who had weathered too many storms together. Cole pushed through the door of Murphy's Saloon, not for drink. He'd never been much of a drinking man, but for the conversation that flowed as freely as the whiskey. Sean Murphy, a barrel-chested Irishman with silver threading through his red beard, looked up from wiping down glasses. "Morning, Sheriff. Coffee's fresh, if you're interested." "Much obliged, Sean." Cole accepted the steaming mug and settled onto a worn bar stool. "How's business treating you?" Sean's expression grew thoughtful. "Can't complain, though I worry about some folks. Tom Morrison was in here again last night. Drank more than a grieving man should, if you catch my meaning." Cole's jaw tightened slightly. He'd known Tom Morrison for years, had watched him transform from a hopeful young farmer into a devoted husband and father. Sarah Morrison's death 6 months ago had hit the entire community hard, but nobody had suffered more than Tom and his 7-year-old daughter Clara. "How bad was it?" "Bad enough that I cut him off early." He mumbled something about not being able to look at his daughter without seeing Sarah's eyes. Sean's voice carried the weight of a man who'd witnessed too many broken souls seeking solace at the bottom of a bottle. "That little girl deserves better than watching her father drown in grief." Cole nodded, his mind already working through the implications. In a town like Millfield, everyone's business became everyone's concern, but the law required more than community gossip to act. Still, the seed of worry had been planted. He finished his coffee and continued his rounds, stopping at Henderson's General Store, where Martha Henderson, a woman whose practical wisdom had guided 3 generations of Millfield families, sorted through inventory with the efficiency of someone who knew every item's proper place. "Sheriff Hayes," she greeted him warmly. "I was hoping you'd stop by. Little Clara Morrison was in here yesterday with her father. Sweet child, but she looked thin, and her dress had seen better days." Martha's observations carried weight. She'd raised 4 children of her own and had a keen eye for when something wasn't right in a family's world. "Tom's struggling," Cole acknowledged carefully. "That he is. But struggling's one thing. Neglecting that precious child is another entirely." Martha's tone carried the firm conviction of someone who'd never hesitated to speak truth when children's welfare was at stake. Sarah would be heartbroken to see her daughter going without proper care. The mention of Sarah's name stirred something deep in Cole's chest, a familiar ache he'd carried for years. Sarah Mitchell had been the one that got away, the woman who'd captured his heart during a brief, magical summer 15 years ago. She'd been visiting her aunt in Millfield, a city girl with dreams as big as the Montana sky. For 3 months, Cole had believed he'd found his future in her laughter and her gentle touch. But summer ended, as summers do, and Sarah returned to her life in Denver. Cole had been too proud, too uncertain of his ability to provide the kind of life she deserved, to ask her to stay. 2 years later, he learned she'd married Tom Morrison, a good man who'd offered her the stability Cole had convinced himself he couldn't provide. Now, walking past the small white church where Sarah and Tom had exchanged vows, Cole wondered how different things might have been if he'd found the courage to fight for love, instead of accepting defeat with quiet dignity. Deputy Jake Wilson met him at the courthouse steps, his young face creased with concern. At 28, Jake carried himself with the earnest determination of someone still learning to balance the weight of responsibility with the wisdom that only came through experience. "Sheriff, we might have a problem brewing. Got a call from the Hendersons' neighbor about shouting coming from the Morrison place last night. Didn't warrant a formal complaint, but thought you should know." Cole's stomach tightened. The Morrison farm sat 3 miles outside town, isolated enough that neighbors wouldn't hear ordinary family disputes. If the shouting had carried that far, it suggested something more serious than grief-driven arguments. Any other reports? Nothing official, but folks are talking. Tom's been spotted in town more often, and not always steady on his feet. Clara's been walking to school alone lately, which isn't like Tom. He used to drive her every morning and pick her up every afternoon. Cole remembered those happier days when Tom's devotion to his family had been evident to everyone in town. He'd seen Tom at school events, beaming with pride as Clara performed in the Christmas pageant or received recognition for her reading achievements. Sarah had often joked that Tom loved their daughter so much he'd probably follow her to college if she'd let him. The afternoon brought its usual rhythm of minor disputes and administrative duties, but Cole's thoughts kept returning to the Morrison family. As evening approached and the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, he found himself thinking about Sarah's final days. He'd visited her in the hospital, of course. The whole town had rallied around the family when her illness took a sudden turn for the worse. Sarah had looked fragile in that sterile white bed, but her spirit remained strong. She'd spoken about her fears for Clara, about her hope that Tom would find a way through his grief, about the dreams she'd held for their small farm becoming something Clara could be proud of. "Promise me something, Cole," Sarah had whispered. During one of his visits, her hand surprisingly strong as it gripped his. "If Tom ever needs help, if Clara ever needs someone to look out for her, don't let pride keep you from doing what's right." He'd promised, never imagining how profoundly those words would soon shape his life. The courthouse clock was chiming 7 when Cole decided to lock up for the evening. Millfield settled into its familiar evening routine, porch lights flickering, on families gathering around dinner tables, children completing homework assignments before bedtime stories and prayers. But as Cole walked toward his small house behind the courthouse, his peaceful evening was shattered by the sound of running footsteps on the wooden sidewalk. He turned to see a small figure racing toward him, pigtails bouncing, face streaked, with tears that caught the lamplight like broken glass. Clara Morrison burst into his field of vision like a force of nature, her 7-year-old frame trembling with fear and exhaustion. Her blue dress, the same one Martha Henderson had noticed was showing wear, was torn at the shoulder and dirt smudged her pale cheeks. "Sheriff Hayes!" she cried, her voice breaking with the kind of desperation that cuts straight through an adult's heart. "You have to help me. Please, you have to come right now." Cole dropped to one knee, bringing himself to her eye level. His voice remained calm despite the alarm bells ringing in his mind. "What's wrong, Clara? What's happened?" "It's my daddy," she sobbed, wiping her nose with the back of her small hand. "He's drinking again, and he's different this time. He's angry, and he's saying terrible things about Mama, and I'm scared he's going to hurt himself or me." The words hit Cole like a physical blow. In his 15 years of law enforcement, he'd responded to countless domestic situations, but this felt different. This was Sarah's daughter, standing before him with the same green eyes that had once looked at him with love, pleading for protection from the man who was supposed to keep her safe. "Clara, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Can you do that for me?" She nodded bravely, though her lower lip continued to tremble. "Daddy came home from town real late, and he could barely walk straight. He started yelling at Mama's picture, saying it was her fault for leaving us. Then he threw the picture across the room, and it broke. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I tried to pick up the pieces, and he yelled at me too. He said I looked too much like her, that every time he saw my face, it reminded him of what he'd lost." Cole's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained gentle. "Where is he now, sweetheart?" "I think he's passed out on the kitchen floor. There was an empty bottle next to him, and he wasn't moving when I ran away." Clara's eyes widened with sudden fear. "What if he's hurt? What if something bad happened to him because I left?" "You did exactly the right thing by coming to find me," Cole assured her, his mind already calculating the 3-mile distance to the Morrison farm and the fastest route to get there. "You were brave and smart, and your mama would be proud of you." At the mention of her mother, Clara's composure cracked completely. She threw herself into Cole's arms with the desperate trust that only a child could offer, clinging to him as if he were her last hope in a world that had suddenly become too dangerous and unpredictable. Cole held her close, inhaling the scent of her hair, a mixture of childhood sweetness and the fear-induced sweat of someone who'd run 3 miles in the dark. Through her thin frame, he could feel her heart racing like a trapped bird's wings. "Everything's going to be all right," he whispered, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "I'm going to take care of this, Clara. I'm going to take care of you." As he lifted the exhausted child into his arms and carried her toward his office, Cole couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. Sarah's final request echoed in his memory, but he sensed that helping Clara might require more than he'd ever imagined when he made that promise. The silver locket Sarah had always worn, the one Tom had buried with her, flashed in Cole's memory. Inside had been a photograph from their wedding day, but Cole remembered Sarah mentioning she'd replaced it with a picture of Clara shortly after her daughter's birth. It struck him now as significant, though he couldn't yet understand why. What he did know, with absolute certainty, was that Clara Morrison had just become the most important case of his career. Not because of the law, but because some promises transcended duty, reaching into the deepest chambers of the human heart, where love and regret intertwined like vines growing toward the same distant light. Cole settled Clara into the worn leather chair behind his desk, wrapping his jacket around her small shoulders. Her breathing had steadied, but the fear in her green eyes remained as sharp as broken glass. He kept his movements deliberate and calm, the way he'd learned to handle frightened animals. No sudden gestures, no raised voices, just steady presence that promised safety. "Clara, I need to go check on your father, but I don't want to leave you here alone. Is there someone in town you'd feel comfortable staying with while I'm gone?" She considered this with the solemnity that seemed to age her beyond her 7 years. "Mrs. Henderson is nice. She always gives me penny candy when Daddy brings me to the store." Cole nodded, already mentally calculating the logistics. Martha Henderson would ask questions, but she'd also provide the kind of maternal comfort Clara needed right now. More importantly, Martha had raised her own children through difficult times and understood when to probe and when to simply offer silent support. "That's a fine choice. Let me walk you over there, and then I'll drive out to check on your father." The evening air carried the scent of approaching autumn as they made their way down Main Street. Millfield's handful of street lamps cast pools of yellow light, creating islands of warmth in the gathering darkness. Clara's hand found his naturally, her small fingers still trembling slightly as they wrapped around his calloused palm. Martha Henderson answered her door before Cole finished knocking, as if she'd been watching from her window. Her sharp eyes immediately assessed Clara's condition. The torn dress, the streaked face, the way the child pressed close to Cole's side for protection. "Lord have mercy," Martha murmured, opening her door wider. "Come in, both of you. Clara, honey, you look like you could use some hot cocoa and maybe a warm bath." Cole explained the situation in careful terms, emphasizing Clara's bravery in seeking help while minimizing the details that might frighten her further. Martha's expression grew increasingly grim, but her voice remained gentle when she addressed the child. "You'll be safe here, sweetheart. I've got fresh cookies in the oven and my late husband's old quilts to keep you warm. Sheriff Hayes is going to take care of your daddy, aren't you, Sheriff?" "That's exactly what I'm going to do," Cole promised, meeting Martha's knowing gaze. They'd known each other long enough for her to read the determination in his eyes, as well as something deeper, a personal investment that went beyond professional duty. Clara looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold too much understanding. "For someone so young, you'll bring him home safe?" "I'll do everything in my power to help your father, Clara. You have my word on that." The drive to the Morrison farm felt longer than usual, giving Cole too much time to think about what he might find. Tom Morrison had never been a violent man, but grief and alcohol could transform even the gentlest souls into something unrecognizable. Cole had seen it happen before. Good men broken by loss, lashing out at the world that had taken away everything they held dear. The farmhouse sat dark against the star-scattered sky, no lights visible in any of the windows. Cole parked his truck near the front porch and approached carefully, his hand resting on his weapon, but hoping he wouldn't need to draw it. The front door stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the evening breeze. "Tom?" he called out, pushing. The door opened wider. "It's Cole Hayes. I'm coming in to check on you." The smell hit him immediately. Stale alcohol, unwashed dishes, and the musty odor of a house where grief had taken up residence. Cole's eyes adjusted to the dim interior, revealing overturned furniture, broken glass scattered across the floor, and in the center of it all, Tom Morrison sprawled unconscious beside the kitchen table. An empty whiskey bottle lay on its side near Tom's outstretched hand, and Cole's heart sank as he recognized the signs of someone who'd drunk himself into oblivion. But as he knelt beside the unconscious man, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Clara's torn dress hadn't been the only casualty of the evening's violence. Tom's knuckles were bloodied, and fresh scratches marked his face and arms. "Tom," Cole said firmly, shaking the man's shoulder. "Tom, wake up. We need to talk." Tom stirred slowly, his eyes struggling to focus as consciousness reluctantly returned. When he finally managed to sit up, the sight of Cole's uniform seemed to penetrate the alcoholic haze. "Sheriff?" Tom's voice came out as a croak, confusion mixing with embarrassment. "What are you doing here?" "Your daughter came to find me, Tom." She was scared. The words hit Tom like a physical blow. His face crumpled, and for a moment, Cole glimpsed the broken man beneath the anger and alcohol. "Clara? Is she all right? Oh God, did I hurt her? She's safe. She's staying with Martha Henderson tonight." Cole kept his voice steady, professional, even as his heart ached for both father and daughter. "But we need to talk about what happened here." Tom struggled to his feet, swaying slightly as the room spun around him. His gaze fell on the broken picture frame that had once held Sarah's photograph, and fresh tears began streaming down his face. "I can't do this, Cole. I can't raise that little girl alone. Every time I look at her, I see Sarah's eyes, Sarah's smile, and it's like losing her all over again." His voice broke completely. What kind of father can't even look at his own daughter without falling apart? Cole had prepared himself for anger, for violence, for the kind of confrontation that required careful de-escalation. He hadn't prepared himself for this. Raw, honest grief that stripped away every defense and left a man's soul exposed like a wound. "The kind who's drowning in pain and doesn't know how to swim back to shore," Cole said quietly. "But that doesn't mean you're beyond help, Tom, and it doesn't mean Clara has to pay the price for your grief." Tom sank onto one of the few unbroken chairs, his head buried in his hands. She deserves so much better than this. Sarah made me promise I'd take care of our daughter, and look at what I've become. I'm a drunk, a failure, everything Sarah never wanted for Clara's father. The broken glass beneath Cole's boots crunched as he moved closer, and he found himself looking at the scattered remains of Sarah's photograph. Her face smiled up at him from behind cracked glass, and suddenly he was 22 again, holding her in his arms under a summer moon, believing that love could conquer any obstacle life might place in their path. "Tell me about that night, Tom. What happened before Clara ran away?" Tom's hands shook as he tried to piece together the fragments of memory through his alcoholic haze. "I came home from Murphy's. Had too much to drink, more than usual. Saw Sarah's picture on the mantel, and something just snapped. Started thinking about how she left us, how she promised she'd never leave and then died anyway." His voice grew stronger, anger creeping in alongside the grief. "I started yelling at her picture, telling her how angry I was, how unfair it was for her to abandon us. Clara came running in, trying to calm me down the way she always does." Tom's face crumpled again. "That's when I lost it completely. Told her she looked too much like her mother, that seeing her face was torture." Cole felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What else, Tom?" I threw Sarah's picture across the room, watched it shatter against the wall. Clara started crying. Tried to pick up the pieces to fix it. When I saw her kneeling there in the broken glass, trying to put her mother's face back together, Tom's voice trailed off, horror creeping into his expression. I grabbed her arm, maybe too hard, told her to leave it alone, that some things it couldn't be fixed. The image of Clara's torn dress suddenly made perfect sense. In his drunken fury, Tom had handled his daughter roughly enough to tear her clothing, roughly enough to send a 7-year-old child running 3 miles in the dark to seek help from the only authority figure she trusted. That's when she ran. Tom nodded miserably. "I was so angry, so drunk, I just let her go. Figured she'd come back when she got tired or scared. But then I kept drinking, and everything went black until you woke me up just now." Cole looked around the destroyed kitchen, at the man broken by grief and alcohol, at the shattered remains of a family photograph that had once represented hope and love. This wasn't just about domestic violence or child endangerment, though. Both charges could easily apply. This was about a family torn apart by loss, about a little girl who'd lost her mother and was now losing her father to his own demons. But there was something else. Something Tom had said that nagged at the edges of Cole's consciousness. Clara's resemblance to her mother wasn't unusual. Children often favored one parent over another, yet Tom's reaction seemed extreme, almost as if looking at his daughter caused him physical pain beyond normal grief. "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Has Clara always reminded you strongly of Sarah?" Tom looked confused by the question. "What do you mean? You said seeing Clara's face was torture because she looked so much like her mother. But she's 7 years old now. Didn't she look like Sarah when she was born, when she was a toddler?" A strange expression crossed Tom's face, confusion mixed with something that might have been realization. "You know, that's the thing. When Clara was little, everyone said she looked just like me. Same nose, same chin. It's only in the last couple years that people started saying she favored Sarah." Cole's heart began beating faster, though he couldn't yet articulate why. "When did you first notice the resemblance?" "Maybe when she turned 5 or 6, her eyes started looking more like Sarah's and her hair got darker. Sometimes I'd catch her making an expression that was pure Sarah, and it would just about stop. My heart." The pieces weren't fitting together the way Cole expected, but he filed the information away for later consideration. Right now, his immediate concern was ensuring Clara's safety and getting Tom the help he desperately needed. "Here's what's going to happen, Tom. Tonight, Clara stays with Martha Henderson. Tomorrow, you're going to check yourself into the clinic in Billings and get help for your drinking. And you're going to stay there until the doctors say you're ready to be a father again." Tom looked up sharply. "You're not arresting me?" "Not tonight. But this is your one chance, Tom. If you ever lay a hand on that child again, if she ever has, to run away from her own home in fear, I'll throw you in a cell and throw away the key. Clara needs her father, but she needs him sober and whole. As Cole prepared to leave the broken farmhouse, he took one last look around the room where a family's life had imploded. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations, painful decisions, and the long process of healing for both father and daughter. But tonight, Clara was safe, and that was all that mattered. The torn blue dress would become a symbol in his mind, childhood innocence threatened but not destroyed, a little girl brave enough to seek help when the adults in her life had failed. Her. As he drove back toward town, Cole found himself thinking about the promises people make and the unexpected ways life asks them to keep those promises. Sarah's final request echoed in his memory, but now it carried new weight. Taking care of Clara might require more than occasional check-ins or community support. It might require him to become something he'd never imagined being, a father to the daughter of the woman he'd once loved, raised by the man she'd chosen instead of him. The morning sun filtered through Martha Henderson's lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the kitchen table where Clara sat, methodically eating pancakes with the careful politeness of a child trying not to be a burden. She'd slept fitfully in the guest room, waking twice from nightmares that sent her padding down the hallway to make sure the adults were still there, still protecting her from whatever darkness her 7-year-old mind conjured. And Cole arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, his hat in his hands and his expression carefully neutral. Martha met him at the door, with coffee already poured and the kind of knowing look that came from decades of reading people's hearts. She asked about her father 6 times before breakfast, Martha whispered. Wants to know if he's all right, if he's sorry, if he still loves her. What do I tell a child whose world just fell apart? The truth. As much as she can understand. Cole accepted the coffee gratefully, needing the warmth to combat the chill that had settled in his bones during a mostly sleepless night. Is she ready to see me? Clara looked up when Cole entered the kitchen, her green eyes searching his face for answers to questions she was too young to fully articulate. She'd been cleaned up and given one of Martha's granddaughter's dresses to wear, pink with tiny flowers, too big in the shoulders but cinched with a belt that made it work well enough. Sheriff Hayes, she said solemnly, setting down her fork with the careful precision that seemed to characterize everything she did. Is my daddy going to jail? Cole pulled out a chair and sat at her eye level, the same technique he'd used the night before. Your daddy isn't going to jail, Clara. But he is going to go somewhere to get help so he can learn to feel better about losing your mama. Like a hospital, something like that. A place where doctors help people who are sad learn how to be happy again. Clara considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence. Will I be able to visit him? When the doctors say he's ready for visitors, yes, but that might not be for a few weeks. The tears that gathered in Clara's eyes threatened to break Cole's heart completely. Where will I live while he's gone? I don't have any grandparents or aunts or uncles. Martha moved behind Clara's chair, her hands settling gently on the child's shoulders. Sweetie, you're welcome to stay here as long as you need to. I've got plenty of room and I could use the company. But Clara shook her head, her lower lip trembling. I want to go home. I want to take care of my daddy's farm and make sure everything's all right when he comes back. Cole exchanged a glance with Martha over Clara's head. The Morrison farm was no place for a 7-year-old to live alone, but he understood her need to maintain some connection to the life she'd known before everything changed. Tell you what, Cole said carefully. How about if we go out to your farm today and pick up some of your things, your clothes, your toys, anything that would make you feel more at home here with Mrs. Henderson? Clara's face brightened slightly. Can we check on the chickens too? Daddy sometimes forgets to feed them, and they get scared when they're hungry. The simple request hit Cole harder than he'd expected. Here was a child worried about hungry chickens while her own world crumbled. Around her, still thinking about her responsibilities, even as the adults in her life failed to meet theirs. An hour later, Cole's truck bumped along the rutted road to the Morrison farm, with Clara bouncing slightly in the passenger seat, her small hands clutched tightly in her lap. She'd insisted on bringing a bag of chicken feed from Henderson's store, paid for with coins she'd carefully counted from a small purse that had belonged to her mother. The farmhouse looked different in daylight, shabby rather than menacing, neglected rather than violent. Cole realized this was the first time he'd seen the Morrison property since Sarah's death, and the deterioration was more extensive than he'd imagined. Weeds had overtaken what had once been Sarah's vegetable garden. Fence posts leaned at dangerous angles, and the barn's roof showed gaps where shingles had blown away in recent storms. Clara noticed none of this. She jumped down from the truck and ran toward the chicken coop with single-minded determination, calling out to the birds with the kind of affection most children reserved for puppies or kittens. "Don't worry, girls," she told the chickens as she scattered feed with practiced efficiency. "Daddy's going to get better, and Sheriff Hayes is taking care of everything until he comes home." Cole watched her work, noting the competence with which she handled tasks that seemed too advanced for her age. This wasn't a child playing at farm chores. This was someone who'd been helping maintain the family's small operation out of necessity rather than fun. Inside the house, Cole began gathering Clara's belongings while she supervised with the kind of detailed instructions that revealed how precisely organized her 7-year-old world had been. Her bedroom was the only space in the house that remained untouched by Tom's destructive episode. A small sanctuary of carefully arranged toys, books stacked by height, and a dresser where her clothes were folded with military precision. "Mama taught me how to keep everything neat," Clara explained, carefully placing her favorite stuffed rabbit into a small suitcase. She said a tidy room meant a tidy mind, and tidy minds could handle anything that came their way. While Clara packed, Cole found himself drawn to the hallway where family photographs lined the walls. Most showed Tom, Sarah, and Clara at various stages of the child's young life. Birthdays, holidays, everyday moments preserved in small frames that told the story of a family that had once been happy. But it was a particular photograph that stopped Cole in his tracks. Clara, at age 5, standing between her parents in front of the farmhouse, grinning with the unself-conscious joy that belonged uniquely to childhood. The resemblance to Sarah was there, certainly, but looking more closely, Cole could see other features that seemed familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. Clara's chin had a distinctive cleft that Cole recognized because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. Her ears, barely visible beneath her dark hair, had the same unusual curve that had made Cole self-conscious as a child. And her hands, small and delicate now, but with long fingers that seemed to promise height and strength she hadn't yet grown into, looked remarkably similar to the hands that had held this very photograph. "Sheriff Hayes?" Clara appeared at his elbow, having finished her packing with characteristic efficiency. "Are you looking at Mama's pictures?" "Just remembering what a beautiful family you had," Cole managed, though his mind was racing through calculations and possibilities he wasn't ready to consider. "She was the prettiest mama in the whole world," Clara agreed, with absolute certainty. "Daddy used to say she was too good for either of us, but she always laughed and said families weren't about being good enough. They were about choosing to love each other every single day." The innocence in Clara's voice contrasted sharply with the adult wisdom of the sentiment, and Cole wondered how many of Sarah's deeper thoughts had been shared with her young daughter during quiet moments between mother and child. They spent the morning collecting not just Clara's belongings, but also pieces of the life she'd shared with her parents. A cookbook filled with Sarah's handwritten notes and favorite recipes. A quilt that had covered Clara's bed since she was a baby. Small treasures that would help maintain her connection to the home she couldn't yet return to. But as Cole loaded the last box into his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The timeline of Clara's birth, The way her features had evolved as she'd grown, the intensity of Tom's reaction to her resemblance to Sarah. Pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit the picture he'd always assumed was complete. Clara climbed back into the passenger seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit and looking back at the farmhouse with the kind of longing that belonged to someone far older than 7. "Will everything be the same when Daddy comes home?" she asked quietly. Cole started the engine, buying himself a moment to consider how to answer truthfully without destroying what remained of her hope. "Some things might be different, Clara, but the important things, the love your parents had for you, the memories you've made here, those will always be the same." As they drove back toward town, Cole found himself thinking about Sarah's leather-bound journal, which Tom had mentioned finding among her belongings. Perhaps it contained answers to questions Cole hadn't known he needed to ask. Perhaps it held the key to understanding why a 7-year-old girl's face could cause her father such profound pain, and why looking at that same face filled Cole with a recognition he wasn't yet ready to name. Tom Morrison sat on the narrow bed in the clinic's sparse room, turning his wedding ring over and over between his fingers, a nervous habit he'd developed since Sarah's death. The simple gold band had become a talisman, something to hold on to, when the world felt like it was spinning beyond his control. Sometimes he slipped it off, staring at the pale line it left on his finger, wondering if he had the right to keep wearing the symbol of a marriage that death had ended. Other times, he pushed it back on with fierce determination, as if the metal could somehow maintain his connection to the woman he'd lost. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a woman in her 40s whose calm competence reminded Tom painfully of Sarah, closed his file and leaned back in her chair. "You've been here 3 days now, Tom. How are you feeling about the progress we've made?" "Like I'm walking through fog," Tom admitted, his voice hoarse from the tears that seemed to come without warning. "Some moments I feel almost normal, like I could go home and be a good father to Clara. Other moments I can barely remember why life is worth living without Sarah." Dr. Martinez nodded with the patience of someone who'd guided many people through the treacherous landscape of grief. "That's normal, Tom. Healing isn't linear. You'll have good days and bad days, sometimes good hours and bad hours within the same day." Tom's fingers found the ring again, sliding it off and holding it up to catch the afternoon light filtering through the small window. "I keep thinking about the night Clara ran away, the things I said to her, the way I grabbed her arm. What kind of man does that to his own daughter? A man who's drowning in pain and doesn't know how to swim back to shore," Dr. Martinez said, echoing words Tom had heard before. "But recognizing the problem is the first step toward fixing it." Meanwhile, back in Millfield, Cole was discovering that caring for a 7-year-old, even temporarily, required skills he'd never developed. Clara had been staying with Martha Henderson for a week now, but she seemed to gravitate toward Cole whenever he stopped by to check on her progress. She'd started appearing at the courthouse after school, doing homework at his desk, while he handled the day's administrative duties. "Sheriff Hayes," Clara said one afternoon, looking up from her mathematics workbook with the kind of serious expression that made her seem far older than her years. "Mrs. Henderson says you never got married or had children of your own. Why not?" Cole nearly choked on his coffee. The directness of children never failed to catch him off guard, especially when they asked questions that cut straight to the heart of his deepest regrets. "Well, I suppose I never found the right person at the right time," he said carefully, though memories of Sarah immediately flooded his mind. Clara considered this with the gravity of a philosopher pondering life's great mysteries. "Mama used to say that sometimes the right person was right in front of you, but you had to be brave enough to see them." The words hit Cole like a physical blow. Sarah had said something similar to him during their last conversation in the hospital, though he'd been too focused on her illness to fully understand what she meant. "Your mama was a wise woman. She was the wisest woman in the whole world," Clara agreed with absolute conviction. "She knew everything about everything, especially about people's hearts." That evening, Cole found himself standing outside the Morrison farmhouse, keys in hand, and a sense of purpose he couldn't quite name driving him forward. Tom had given him permission to check on the property while he was in treatment, but Cole's real motivation had nothing to do with maintenance or security. He was looking for Sarah's journal. He found it in the bedroom Tom and Sarah had shared, tucked away in the bottom drawer of Sarah's vanity table, beneath carefully folded scarves and jewelry boxes. The leather cover was soft with age and handling, and Cole's hands trembled slightly as he opened to the first page. Sarah's handwriting flowed across the pages like water, graceful loops and careful crosses that spoke of someone who took time, with words, who believed that thoughts worth thinking were worth recording properly. The early entries dated back to just before Clara's birth, and Cole read with growing fascination as Sarah documented her hopes and fears about becoming a mother. Tom is so excited about the baby. He's already painted the nursery twice, unable to decide between yellow and green, since we don't know if we're having a boy or girl. I haven't told him about my fears, that I might not be a good mother, that I might not love this child the way a mother should. What if my heart isn't big enough? What if I'm too selfish, too focused on my own dreams to put a child first? Cole smiled despite the circumstances. The Sarah he'd known had been anything but selfish, though he understood the self-doubt that plagued expectant mothers. He flipped through several more entries, watching as Sarah's anxiety transformed into wonder and then into the fierce, protective love that had defined her relationship with Clara. But it was an entry dated 8 months before Clara's birth that made Cole's blood run cold. I saw Cole in town today. It's been 2 years since I last laid eyes on him, and my heart still skips like a schoolgirl's when he smiles. Tom was with me, talking to the bank manager about extending our loan, and Cole tipped his hat politely and asked how I was settling into married life. So proper, so distant, as if we'd never held each other under summer stars and made promises we were both too scared to keep. Cole's hands shook as he turned the page, dreading what he might find, but unable to stop reading. I almost told him then, almost said that I'd made a mistake, that I'd married Tom because he was safe and steady and everything Cole wasn't sure he could be. But Tom was right there, beaming with pride about the baby coming, and I couldn't destroy his happiness for the sake of dreams that probably wouldn't have worked out anyway. The next entry was dated 3 days later. Cole came to the house tonight. Tom was at his brother's place, helping with the harvest, and I was alone with my doubts and my growing belly and the weight of all the words I'd never spoken. We sat on the porch swing and talked about everything except what we both knew was between us. When he finally kissed me, it felt like coming home after years of being lost. Cole had to stop reading. The memory of that night came flooding back, with painful clarity. Sarah in her blue dress, her hair catching moonlight, the way she'd looked at him with eyes full of longing and regret. He'd known she was married, known he had no right to the feelings that had never really died. But for one night, they'd pretended that time could move backward, that choices could be unmade, that love could conquer the practical decisions that had shaped their lives. He'd left before dawn, consumed with guilt and certainty that he'd destroyed any chance of maintaining even a friendship with the woman he'd never stopped loving. Sarah had never contacted him afterward, and he'd assumed she regretted their moment of weakness as much as he did. But the journal told a different story. Cole thinks he ruined everything by kissing me, by spending the night holding me, while we both pretended morning would never come. He doesn't understand that for the first time in months I felt like myself again, like the woman who used to dream big dreams instead of settling for safe ones. I won't tell Tom. This baby deserves a father who loves him without reservation. And Tom will be that father, but I also won't pretend that Cole means nothing to me, that our night together was a mistake. Some things are too precious to be called mistakes, even when they can never happen again. Cole closed the journal, his mind reeling with implications he wasn't ready to consider. The timeline was impossible to ignore. Clara's birth had come 7 months after that night, not the 9 months Tom had always assumed, But premature births weren't uncommon, and Tom had never questioned the timing. The ring on Tom's finger suddenly took on new significance. A symbol of marriage, yes, but also of the life Tom had built, believing Clara was his biological daughter. Whether that belief was accurate might matter less than the love Tom had poured into raising her. The bonds formed through 7 years of bedtime stories and scraped knees and father-daughter adventures. But it might also explain why Tom's grief had taken such a destructive turn. If some part of him suspected that Clara's resemblance to Sarah went deeper than ordinary genetic inheritance, if he'd begun to question not just his wife's love, but the very foundation of his identity as Clara's father, then his drinking and anger might stem from more than simple grief. Cole drove back to town with Sarah's journal on the passenger seat beside him, its leather cover containing secrets that could reshape 3 lives. The question wasn't whether he had the right to know the truth about Clara's parentage. The question was whether any of them could handle the consequences of that knowledge, and whether some secrets were too dangerous to unearth, no matter how desperately the heart craved answers. The farm deed lay spread across Cole's kitchen table like an accusation, its official seals and legal language spelling out a financial catastrophe that had been years in the making. He'd spent the morning at the county courthouse researching property records and tax assessments, trying to understand how a family that had once seemed so stable could have fallen so far so fast. The numbers told a story of mounting desperation. 3 years of poor harvests, medical bills from Sarah's illness that had consumed their savings, and a series of predatory loans that had turned the Morrison farm into little more than collateral waiting to be seized. Tom had been fighting a losing battle long before grief and alcohol had claimed what remained of his ability to cope. Clara appeared in the doorway of Cole's kitchen, still wearing the pink dress Martha Henderson had given her, now accessorized. With a sheriff's badge she'd fashioned from cardboard and colored with careful attention to detail. "Are you working on important sheriff business?" she asked, with the solemnity that seemed to characterize all her interactions with adults. "I'm trying to help your daddy with some problems he's been having," Cole said carefully, folding the deed and slipping it back into its envelope. "Have you had breakfast yet?" "Mrs. Henderson made me oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins. She says it's brain food that will help me grow up smart and strong like my mama." Clara climbed onto the chair across from Cole, her small hands folded precisely in her lap. "Sheriff Hayes, can I ask you something important?" "Of course, sweetheart. Do. You think my daddy stopped loving me because I look like mama?" The question hit Cole like a punch to the solar plexus. In the 2 weeks since Tom had entered treatment, Clara had been remarkably resilient, adapting to her temporary living situation. With Martha Henderson, with the kind of grace that spoke to her fundamental emotional strength. But clearly, she'd been thinking deeply about the events that had led to this upheaval in her young life. "Your daddy loves you more than anything in this world, Clara. Sometimes when people are very sad, they have trouble showing their love the right way, but that doesn't mean the love isn't there." Clara considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing testimony. "Mrs. Henderson says that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes because they're hurting too much to think clearly. She says it doesn't make the mistakes okay, but it helps explain why good people sometimes do bad things." The wisdom of Martha Henderson never ceased to amaze Cole. The woman had raised 4 children of her own and helped dozens of other families navigate crises over the years, and she seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of how to communicate complex emotional truths to a 7-year-old mind. "Mrs. Henderson is very wise," Cole agreed. "Your daddy made some mistakes because he was hurting so much about losing your mama. But he's getting help now, so he can learn better ways to handle his sadness. Will he be coming home soon?" Cole had spoken with Dr. Martinez the previous day, and the prognosis was cautiously optimistic. Tom was responding well to treatment, participating in group therapy sessions, and beginning to develop healthier coping mechanisms for his grief. But his recovery would be measured in months rather than weeks, and even then, his return home would need to be carefully managed. It will probably be a few more weeks before the doctors think he's ready to come home. But when he does, things will be better than they were before. Clara nodded with the kind of patient acceptance that seemed far too mature for her age. I'll wait as long as it takes. Families should stick together, even when it's hard. After Clara returned to Martha Henderson's house for her morning tutoring session, Martha had been a school teacher before her marriage and was ensuring Clara didn't fall behind in her studies. Cole found himself driving toward the Morrison farm with a sense of purpose that went beyond property maintenance. The financial documents had revealed more than just impending foreclosure. They'd also shown a pattern of increasingly desperate borrowing that suggested Tom had been hiding the family's true financial situation from Sarah, at least in the final months of her illness. The man who had seemed like such a devoted husband and provider had been juggling multiple loans, refinancing agreements, and payment deferrals in an increasingly frantic attempt to keep his family afloat. But there was something else in the paperwork that had caught Cole's attention, a life insurance policy that Tom had taken out on Sarah just 18 months before her death. The policy wasn't unusual in itself. Many couples carried life insurance to protect their families. What was unusual was the amount, nearly enough to pay off all the farm's debts and provide Clara with a comfortable future. Yet the insurance money had never been claimed. Cole found Tom's desk in the farmhouse study, a cramped space that doubled as Sarah's sewing room and the family's record-keeping center. The desk drawers were filled with the detritus of a man struggling to manage responsibilities that had grown beyond his capabilities. Unpaid bills mixed with school newsletters, tax forms scattered among Clara's artwork, and in the bottom drawer, a manila envelope that contained the unclaimed insurance policy. The covering letter from the insurance company was dated 3 months after Sarah's death, explaining the claims process and requesting the necessary documentation. Subsequent letters grew increasingly urgent, warning that the claim would expire if not filed within the year. The final letter, dated just 2 weeks before Tom's breakdown, stated that the window for filing had officially closed. Cole sat back in Tom's chair, trying to understand why a man desperate for money would allow a substantial insurance settlement to expire unclaimed. The answer, when it came to him, was both heartbreaking and illuminating. Tom had been consumed by guilt. Whether that guilt stemmed from his inability to save Sarah from her illness, his relief at her suffering finally ending, or something deeper and more complex, it had prevented him from taking the practical steps necessary to secure his daughter's future. Instead, he'd chosen to sink deeper into debt and despair, as if claiming the insurance money would somehow betray Sarah's memory or profit from her death. The tragedy of it left Cole feeling hollow. If Tom had simply filed the claim, Clara would never have had to worry about losing her home. The financial pressure that had driven Tom to drink might never have reached critical levels. The family might have found a way to heal together instead of falling apart in isolation. But as Cole prepared to leave the farmhouse, he discovered something that changed his understanding of the situation entirely. Hidden behind Sarah's sewing supplies, he found a small wooden box filled with recipes written in Sarah's careful handwriting. But these weren't ordinary recipes. They were accompanied by detailed notes about family traditions, stories about where each dish had come from, memories Sarah wanted to preserve for Clara's future. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope with Cole's name written across it in Sarah's distinctive script. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a letter dated just 2 weeks before Sarah's death. "My dear Cole, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Clara needs someone to watch over her. I've left instructions with Martha Henderson to make sure this letter reaches you if anything happens to me. I need you to know that the night we spent together changed everything for me, not because it made me love Tom less, but because it reminded me what it felt like to be completely myself with someone who understood every part of my heart. I've never told anyone this, not even Tom, but I've always wondered if Clara might be yours. The timing is close enough that it could go either way, and honestly, I've never wanted to know for certain. Tom loves her with his whole heart, and she loves him back the same way. Biology matters less than the bonds we choose to build. But if something happens to Tom, if he can't be the father Clara needs, I'm asking you to step in. Not because of what Clara might be to you biologically, but because I know the kind of man you are. I know you'll love her and protect her and help her grow into the strong, independent woman she's meant to become. I'm not asking you to take her away from Tom or to disrupt the family we've built together. I'm asking you to be her guardian angel, the way you've always been mine. Even when I was too stubborn or scared to accept your protection, watch over them both, Cole. They'll need someone who understands that love isn't always simple or easy, but it's always worth fighting for. All my love, Sarah. P.S. I've hidden this box where only someone who really knew me would think to look. If you found it, then you know me better than I ever gave you credit for. Cole read the letter 3 times, Sarah's words reshaping his understanding of everything that had happened. She'd known about the insurance policy. Her recipe box contained a copy of the documentation. She'd understood Tom's pride and his tendency to shoulder burdens alone, and she'd planned for the possibility that her husband might not be able to care for Clara without help, but most importantly, she'd given him permission to love Clara without guilt, regardless of biology. Whether Clara was his daughter or Tom's mattered less than the commitment to be the kind of adult presence in her life that would honor Sarah's memory and ensure her daughter's happiness. As Cole drove back to town with Sarah's letter in his pocket, he realized that the financial crisis threatening Clara's future was just the latest challenge in what would likely be a long journey toward healing. But for the first time since that terrible night when Clara had run to him for help, he felt like he had a clear path forward. Sarah's recipe box would represent more than preserved family traditions. It would become a symbol of the legacy she'd entrusted to his care, the responsibility to help Clara grow up knowing she was loved, protected, and valued for exactly who she was, regardless of the circumstances that had brought her into the world. Sarah's recipe box sat on Cole's kitchen counter like a treasure chest waiting to be properly explored. Over the past 3 days, he'd been working through its contents with Clara during their after-school sessions, reading Sarah's carefully preserved memories and attempting to recreate the dishes that had defined the Morrison family's traditions. Mama always said that cooking was like telling stories with your hands, Clara explained, standing on a step stool beside Cole as they attempted Sarah's famous apple pie. Her small fingers worked the dough with surprising competence, guided by memories of countless afternoons spent helping her mother in their farmhouse kitchen. She wrote here that this recipe came from her grandmother. Cole read from Sarah's notes, his voice catching slightly as he recognized the love woven through every instruction. Says her grandmother believed that food made with love could heal any hurt that wasn't too deep to reach. Clara nodded solemnly. Mama made this pie the night before she went to the hospital the last time. She said it was important for me to remember that our family's love would always be with me, even when she couldn't be. The wisdom contained in Sarah's preserved traditions went far beyond cooking instructions. Each recipe was accompanied by stories about Clara's heritage, lessons about perseverance and kindness, and gentle guidance about navigating the complexities of growing up. It was as if Sarah had known her time was limited and had poured everything she wanted to teach her daughter into these carefully written pages. But it was a recipe for Clara's birthday cake that stopped Cole in his tracks. Written in Sarah's characteristic careful script was a note that made his blood run cold. Clara's 7th birthday, chocolate cake with vanilla frosting, 7 candles for 7 years of joy. Tom still doesn't know about the timing, and I pray he never needs to. But if something happens to me, if questions arise about Clara's parentage, remember that love makes a family, not genetics. She has Tom's kindness and my stubbornness, but her courage comes from somewhere else entirely. Watch her eyes when she's determined about something. She gets a look that reminds me of someone I once knew who never backed down from doing what was right. Cole's hand shook as he closed the recipe box. Clara focused on her pie making with the intense concentration that characterized her approach to everything important, didn't notice his sudden pallor. "Sheriff Hayes, are you feeling all right? You look like you might be getting sick." "I'm fine, sweetheart, just thinking about something your mama wrote." That afternoon, while Clara was at Martha Henderson's house for her piano lesson, Cole found himself walking the streets of Millfield with no particular destination in mind. The town seemed smaller than usual, its familiar landmarks insufficient to contain the questions that had begun consuming his thoughts. He'd always assumed that Clara's resemblance to him was coincidental, the kind of random genetic similarity that sometimes occurred between unrelated people. But Sarah's journal entries, combined with her cryptic notes in the recipe box, painted a different picture entirely. The timeline was impossible to ignore. Clara had been born 7 months after his night with Sarah, supposedly premature, but healthy enough to suggest that her early arrival might not have been as early as everyone assumed. And now, watching her grow and develop, Cole couldn't deny the accumulating evidence of physical similarities that went beyond mere coincidence. Clara's laugh, when she was genuinely delighted about something, had the same slightly raspy quality that Cole's sister used to tease him about. Her habit of tilting her head when she was thinking deeply mirrored his own unconscious gesture. And her hands, those long, elegant fingers that seemed destined for strength and skill, were unmistakably similar to his own. But even more than physical resemblance, Clara's personality traits seemed to echo qualities Cole recognized in himself and his family. Her fierce protectiveness of people she loved, her instinctive sense of justice, her tendency to carry responsibilities that seemed too heavy for her small shoulders. All of these reminded him of his own childhood, his own way of moving through the world. The sound of his name being called interrupted his brooding. Deputy Jake Wilson was jogging toward him, his face flushed with exertion and concern. "Sheriff, I've been looking for you everywhere. We've got a problem at the Morrison place." Cole's heart clenched with immediate fear for Clara's safety, though she was supposedly safe at her piano lesson. "What kind of problem?" Bank representatives showed up with a sheriff's deputy from the county seat. They're conducting some kind of assessment of the property, taking photographs and measurements. When I asked what was going on, they said it was related to foreclosure proceedings. Cole's jaw tightened. He'd known the foreclosure was imminent, but he'd hoped to have more time to explore alternatives before the bank took action. "How long have they been there?" "About an hour. I would have called you sooner, but I wanted to see if Tom had given them permission first. Turns out they've got legal authority to proceed without his consent." Cole was already walking toward his truck, his mind racing through the implications. If the bank seized the property now, while Tom was still in treatment, Clara would lose not just her home, but any chance of returning to the life she'd known. All of Sarah's carefully preserved memories, all of the family treasures that couldn't be quantified in dollars and cents, would be scattered to the winds. "Jake, I need you to contact Dr. Martinez at the clinic where Tom is staying. Tell her it's urgent that I speak with him today, not next week as originally scheduled." The drive to the Morrison farm felt longer than usual, giving Cole too much time to think about the conversation he was about to have with Tom. The man was finally making progress in his recovery, learning to cope with his grief in healthier ways, beginning to plan for a future that included being Clara's father again. The last thing he needed was the added stress of losing his home, but there was no way around it. The financial crisis that had been building for years was finally reaching its inevitable conclusion, and Tom needed to understand the full extent of what they were facing. Cole found the bank representatives in the barn, a man and woman in business suits that looked painfully out of place among the hay bales and farm equipment. They were methodical in their documentation, photographing everything of value and making notes on clipboards with the detached efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. "Excuse me," Cole called out. his badge clearly visible on his shirt. "I'm Sheriff Hayes. I need to understand what's happening here." The woman, apparently the senior member of the team, looked up from her clipboard with the patient expression of someone accustomed to dealing with law enforcement in these situations. "We're conducting a pre-foreclosure assessment of the property, Sheriff. The owner has defaulted on multiple loan obligations and the bank is preparing to reclaim the property to satisfy the debt." "What's the timeline for this process?" "Mr. Morrison has 30 days to bring all accounts current or make satisfactory payment arrangements. If he fails to do so, the property will be sold at public auction." Cole nodded, his mind already working through possibilities. 30 days wasn't much time, but it might be enough to explore alternatives if Tom was willing to consider options he'd previously rejected out of pride. "I assume Mr. Morrison has been notified of these proceedings." Certified letters were sent to his last known address over the past 3 months. When those went unanswered, we proceeded with legal notification through the county courthouse. Cole realized, with growing frustration, that Tom's breakdown had prevented him from responding to increasingly urgent communications from the bank. Letters that might have led to payment arrangements or extended deadlines had gone unanswered because Tom had been too consumed by grief and alcohol to handle his responsibilities. As he drove back toward town, Cole found himself thinking about Clara's future in ways that went far beyond temporary custody arrangements. If Tom lost the farm, where would they live when he completed his treatment? How would Clara maintain her connection to the home where she'd grown up, where her mother's presence still lingered in every carefully tended flower garden and family photograph? But perhaps more importantly, how could Cole help them navigate this crisis without overstepping the boundaries of his role in their lives? He wasn't Clara's father, regardless of his suspicions about her parentage. He wasn't Tom's family member or legal guardian. He was simply a man who'd made a promise to a dying woman, trying to honor that commitment while respecting the complex dynamics of a family that had been shattered by loss. Sarah's recipe box had become more than a collection of family traditions. It represented the careful preparation of a woman who'd understood that love required planning, that protecting the people you care about meant thinking beyond your own presence in their lives. Sarah had tried to preserve not just recipes and memories, but the very essence of what made their family strong enough to survive whatever challenges the future might bring. Now it was up to Cole to figure out how to honor that legacy while helping Tom and Clara build a future that acknowledged their losses without being defined by them. The path forward was unclear, but one thing was certain. The next few weeks would determine whether Clara grew up remembering her childhood home as a place of love and security, or as something that had been lost to circumstances beyond their control. Clara was helping Cole organize files in his office when she made the innocent comment that changed everything. She'd been sorting through old incident reports with the methodical precision that characterized everything she did, creating neat stacks and occasionally asking questions about unfamiliar words or procedures. "Sheriff Hayes," she said, holding up a faded photograph that had somehow gotten mixed in with the paperwork. "This man looks just like you, but with different clothes." Cole glanced over and felt his breath catch in his throat. The photograph showed his father, James Hayes, in his army uniform from World War II. It had been taken just before his deployment overseas, capturing the same determined expression that Cole saw in his own mirror every morning. "That's my father." "Clara, he was a soldier a long time ago before you were born." Clara studied the photograph with the intense focus she applied to everything that captured her interest. "He has the same eyes as you, and the same chin, too." She looked up at Cole with sudden excitement. "Do I look like my daddy the way you look like yours?" The question should have been simple to answer, but Cole found himself hesitating. In the weeks since Clara had been staying with Martha Henderson, he'd watched her more closely than ever before, and the resemblances he'd begun noticing weren't to Tom Morrison. "You know, sweetheart, I've been wondering about that myself. Let me ask you something. Do you remember looking like your daddy when you were little?" Clara tilted her head in the characteristic gesture that Cole was beginning to realize he'd inherited from his own father. Mrs. Henderson showed me some old pictures of when I was a baby. Everyone always said I looked just like Daddy then, but Mama used to say I was changing as I grew up, that I was starting to look more like her family. A chill ran down Cole's spine. Did your Mama ever tell you anything about her family, about what they looked like? She said her daddy died before I was born, but that he was tall and strong and always did what was right, even when it was hard. Clara's voice carried the reverent tone she always used when talking about her mother's memories. She said I might grow up to be tall like him, and that my hands were getting to look like his hands. Cole looked down at Clara's small hands, with their long fingers and distinctive shape, then at his own larger versions of the same basic structure. The resemblance was impossible to ignore, but he needed more than physical similarities to confirm what he was beginning to suspect. Clara, do you know exactly when your birthday is? I mean, not just the date, but what day of the week it was, or what time of day you were born. August 15th. Mama always said I was born early in the morning, just when the sun was coming up. She said I was in such a hurry to get into the world that I surprised everyone by coming early. Cole's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his desk calendar. He'd been counting backward from Clara's birthday for days, trying to work out the timeline that had been nagging at him since he'd first read Sarah's journal. If Clara had been born on August 15th, and if she'd truly been premature, then conception would have occurred in mid-November the previous year. But Cole remembered exactly where he'd been in mid-November 8 years ago, because that was when Sarah had come to him in the night, when they'd shared the brief reunion that had haunted him ever since. The timing aligned perfectly with Clara's birth, especially if she hadn't been quite as premature as everyone had assumed. Clara, I need to make some phone calls this afternoon. Would you be all right helping Mrs. Henderson with her cooking while I take care of some business? Of course, Sheriff Hayes. She's teaching me how to make her famous dinner rolls. Mama always said Mrs. Henderson made the best bread in 3 counties. After Clara left for Martha Henderson's house, Cole sat alone in his office, staring at the birth certificate he'd quietly obtained from the county records office. Clara Elizabeth Morrison, born August 15th at 6:23 a.m. Father listed as Thomas Morrison, mother listed as Sarah Morrison. Everything appeared normal and legal, exactly what he would have expected to see. But Cole had learned over his years in law enforcement that official documents didn't always tell the complete truth. People made assumptions, especially in small communities where everyone thought they knew everyone else's business. If Sarah had wanted to protect her marriage and Tom's relationship with Clara, she would have had every reason to list Tom as the father, regardless of biological reality. With hands that weren't quite steady, Cole reached for his phone and dialed the number for Millfield General Hospital. Dr. Patricia Wells had been the attending physician for Clara's birth, and while she might not be able to share specific medical information, she might be willing to discuss general circumstances around that time. Dr. Wells, this is Sheriff Hayes. I was wondering if you had a few minutes to talk about something. That's been bothering me. Of course, Cole. Is everything all right? I'm trying to understand some details about Clara Morrison's birth. Nothing that would violate patient confidentiality, but I'm wondering about the circumstances. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Cole, that's a delicate subject. May I ask why you're interested? Clara's been staying with Martha Henderson while Tom gets treatment for his drinking. Some things have come up that make me wonder about the timing of her birth. Another pause, longer this time. I remember that delivery very clearly, actually. Sarah came in during the night, and she was very specific about wanting me to handle everything personally. She said the baby was coming early, but when I examined her, everything seemed to suggest a full-term pregnancy. Cole's heart began beating faster. What do you mean? The baby's development, her size, her reflexes, everything indicated that Clara wasn't premature at all. But Sarah insisted that the dates were correct, that she must have miscalculated her conception timing. Tom was so excited about becoming a father that he never questioned it. Did Sarah seem worried about anything during the delivery? She kept asking me to make sure that Tom was listed as the father on all the paperwork, said it was important for the baby's future that there be no confusion about her parentage. At the time, I assumed it was just the normal anxiety that many women experience. During labor, Cole closed his eyes, feeling the weight of confirmation settling over him like a heavy blanket. Dr. Wells, I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that this stays between us unless Clara's welfare is at stake. I understand. Cole, is there any way to determine paternity without Tom's knowledge, something that wouldn't require his consent or participation? There are ways, but they would require genetic material from both potential fathers and the child. Why are you asking, Cole? The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Cole to confront the truth he'd been dancing around for weeks. Because I think Clara might be my daughter. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. When Dr. Wells finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. Cole, that's a very serious allegation. Do you have any evidence beyond timing and physical resemblance? Sarah's journal entries, notes she left in her recipe box, the way Clara's personality traits mirror things I recognize in my own family. Cole's voice grew stronger as he spoke, conviction replacing uncertainty. Dr. Wells, I spent one night with Sarah 8 months before Clara was born. One night when Tom was out of town and Sarah was struggling with doubts about her marriage. And you think Sarah never told Tom about this possibility? I think Sarah made a choice to protect her marriage and give Clara the most stable family situation possible. Tom is a good man, and he loves Clara with his whole heart. Sarah wouldn't have wanted to destroy that unless she absolutely had to. Dr. Wells sighed deeply. Cole, if what you're suggesting is true, it complicates Clara's situation enormously. Tom's parental rights, the custody arrangements while he's in treatment, even the foreclosure proceedings on the farm, all of that would be affected if Clara isn't legally his child. I know. That's why I need to be absolutely certain before I do anything. Clara's been through enough upheaval in her young life. There's a private clinic in Billings that handles paternity testing with complete discretion. They would need hair samples from both you and Clara, nothing invasive or traumatic for her. Results would be available within a week. Cole felt a mixture of relief and terror at having a concrete path forward. Would the test be admissible in court if custody issues arise? Yes. But Cole, you need to think carefully about what you're asking for. If Clara is your biological daughter, you'll have legal grounds to seek custody, but you'll also be taking her away from the only father she's ever known, potentially destroying Tom's recovery process and forcing a 7-year-old to adjust to yet another dramatic change in her family structure. And if I don't pursue the truth, I'll be allowing her to grow up believing a lie, possibly missing the chance to give her a better life than Tom can provide right now. Those are the stakes, Dr. Wells agreed quietly. But there's something else you need to consider. Sarah was my patient, and I saw how much thought she put into every decision about Clara's future. If she chose not to reveal your potential paternity during her lifetime, she might have had reasons that went beyond protecting Tom's feelings. Cole thought about Sarah's letter, hidden in the recipe box like a secret meant to be discovered only if circumstances became desperate. Sarah had known about the possibility of Clara being his daughter, but she'd also trusted Tom to be the father Clara needed, regardless of biology. Dr. Wells, if I bring Clara in for the test, can you make sure? It seems routine, maybe part of a general health checkup that wouldn't worry her. I can arrange that. But Cole, once you have the results, you'll have to decide what to do with the information. There's no going back to not knowing once you know for certain. After ending the call, Cole sat in his empty office as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. Clara's birth certificate lay open on his desk, its official seals and careful penmanship suddenly seeming less authoritative than they had an hour ago. The photograph of his father stared up at him from the pile of papers where Clara had found it, and Cole found himself studying the features she'd noticed so quickly. The same eyes, the same chin, the same determined expression that seemed to run in the Hayes family like a genetic signature. But it was more than physical resemblance that convinced him. It was the way Clara approached problems with methodical determination, the way she carried responsibilities that seemed too heavy for her small shoulders, the way she instinctively tried to protect the adults in her life from worrying about her needs. All of these traits reminded him not just of himself, but of the Hayes family legacy of quiet strength and unwavering loyalty. The truth was there in every interaction he'd had with Clara, in every moment when he'd felt a connection that went deeper than community responsibility or his promise to Sarah. Clara wasn't just a child he was helping through a family crisis, she was his daughter. And some part of him had known it from the moment she'd run to him for help that first night. But knowing the truth and acting on it were two different things entirely. Tom Morrison might not be Clara's biological father, but he'd raised her with love and devotion for 7 years. He was the man who'd walked the floor with her during teething, who'd taught her to ride a bicycle, who'd read bedtime stories and kissed scraped knees and attended school programs with obvious pride. The question wasn't whether Cole had the right to claim his biological daughter. The question was whether disrupting the family bonds that had sustained Clara through her early childhood would serve her best interests, or simply satisfy his own need to know where he belonged in her story. As evening approached and the time came to collect Clara from Martha Henderson's house, Cole made his decision. He would arrange for the paternity test, but he would wait to reveal the results until he understood exactly how that knowledge could be used to help Clara, rather than complicate her life further. The truth was important, but Clara's happiness and stability were more important still. Whatever the test revealed, Cole's primary obligation remained the same: to honor Sarah's trust by ensuring that Clara grew up knowing she was loved and protected, regardless of which man had the biological right to call himself her father. The results of the paternity test lay sealed in an envelope on Cole's kitchen table, untouched for 3 days, while he struggled with the implications of opening it. Clara had been remarkably cooperative during what Dr. Wells had presented as a routine health screening, chatting cheerfully about school and her piano lessons, while the doctor collected hair samples with professional discretion. Now, as Cole stared at the envelope that contained answers to questions he'd carried for weeks, he found himself thinking about his father's vintage Colt .45, locked in the gun safe that had belonged to 3 generations of Hayes men. The weapon represented the traditional approach to justice: direct, decisive, uncomplicated by moral ambiguity. But the situation facing Cole required a different kind of courage, the kind that involved making difficult decisions without clear guidance about what was right. A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Martha Henderson stood on his porch, her expression more serious than he'd seen it since Clara had first arrived, seeking help. "Cole, we need to talk. Clara's been asking questions I don't know how to answer." He invited Martha inside, noting the way her eyes immediately focused on the sealed envelope. Martha Henderson had raised 4 children and helped countless other families navigate crises over the years. She possessed an intuitive understanding of when adult secrets were affecting children's well-being. "What kind of questions?" "She wants to know why she looks more like you than she does like Tom. She's been studying family photographs, comparing facial features with the kind of systematic attention that 7-year-olds apply to things that puzzle them." Martha settled into the chair across from Cole, her hands folded in her lap with characteristic composure. "Yesterday, she asked me if it was possible for children to have different fathers than the ones on their birth certificates." Cole felt his stomach drop. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that families come in all different shapes, and that the most important thing was being loved and cared for by the adults in her life. But Cole, she's a bright child. She's going to keep asking questions until she gets answers that make sense." The envelope seemed to pulse with significance as Cole considered Martha's words. Clara's innocent curiosity about family resemblances was leading her toward the same conclusions that had taken him weeks to reach. The question wasn't whether she would eventually understand the truth about her parentage, but whether she would discover it through careful explanation from the adults who loved her, or through her own detective work that might leave her feeling betrayed and confused. Martha, if I told you that Clara might not be Tom's biological daughter, how would that change your advice about how to handle this situation? Martha's expression didn't change, but Cole saw something flicker in her eyes. Not surprise, but confirmation of suspicions she'd apparently been harboring. I wondered about that possibility, she admitted quietly. Clara's always been different from Tom in fundamental ways. Her temperament, her way of approaching problems, even the way she moves through the world. I attributed it to Sarah's influence. But watching her with you these past few weeks, I've seen similarities that go deeper than learned behavior. The timing fits, Cole said, his voice barely above a whisper. That night 8 years ago, when Sarah came to me, Clara could be my daughter. Have you opened the test results? Cole shook his head. I'm not sure I'm ready for what they might say. Martha leaned forward, her voice taking on the gentle authority that had guided so many difficult conversations over the years. Cole, that envelope contains information that could change 3 lives forever. Clara deserves to know the truth about where she comes from, but she also deserves to have that truth shared in a way that protects her relationship with both of the men who love her. Both of the men. Tom Morrison might not be Clara's biological father, but he's been her daddy for 7 years. He's the one who taught her to tie her shoes and helped her with homework and held her when she had nightmares. That bond doesn't disappear just because genetics say otherwise. Cole found himself thinking about the conversations he'd had with Dr. Martinez about Tom's progress in treatment. The man was finally beginning to address his grief in healthy ways, developing coping strategies that didn't involve alcohol, planning for a future that included being Clara's father again. Learning that Clara wasn't biologically his daughter might destroy all of that progress, sending him back into the spiral of despair that had nearly cost him everything. But keeping the secret also meant denying Clara the chance to understand her true heritage, and potentially denying Cole the opportunity to be a father to his own child. Martha, what would you do if you were in my position? I'd open that envelope and face whatever truth it contains. Then I'd figure out how to use that information to help Clara have the best possible future, even if that meant making some difficult sacrifices along the way. After Martha left, Cole sat alone with his thoughts and the envelope that had begun to feel like a weight too heavy to carry. Through his kitchen window, he could see Clara playing in Martha's backyard, her dark hair catching the afternoon sunlight as she pushed a swing with the same determined rhythm that characterized everything she did. She was laughing at something only she found funny, and the sound carried across the quiet street like music. Cole realized that this might be the last moment before everything changed, the last time he could watch Clara play without knowing for certain whether she was his daughter or simply a child he'd grown to love like his own. His phone rang, interrupting the moment of peaceful observation. Tom Morrison's voice on the other end sounded stronger than it had in weeks, carrying the cautious optimism of someone who was finally beginning to believe in his own recovery. Cole, I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for Clara. And while I've been here, Dr. Martinez says I'm making good progress, that I might be ready to come home in another few weeks if I continue improving. That's wonderful news, Tom. Clara misses you. I miss her too, more than I can say. But Cole, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Cole's grip tightened on the phone. What is it? Dr. Martinez has been helping me work through some of my issues around Clara's resemblance to Sarah. She thinks part of my drinking problem stems from guilt I've been carrying about something, but I haven't been able to figure out what that guilt is about. Tom, no, let me finish. I've been having dreams, memories from around the time Clara was born. Sarah was acting strange those last few weeks of her pregnancy, almost like she was worried about something. And when Clara was born, Sarah kept asking the nurses to make sure all the paperwork was filled out correctly, that my name was listed properly as the father. Cole's heart began racing. Tom was reconstructing the same timeline that had led to Cole's own suspicions, approaching the truth from a different angle, but heading toward the same devastating conclusion. At the time, I thought Sarah was just being careful about legal details. But looking back, it feels like she was protecting me from something. Like maybe she knew something I didn't know. Tom, you're in a fragile place right now. Maybe these are questions better left for after you've completed your treatment. Cole, I need you to tell me the truth. Is there any possibility that Clara isn't my biological daughter? The question hung in the air like a challenge, demanding an honesty that could destroy Tom's recovery or finally free him from the guilt he'd been carrying. Cole looked at the sealed envelope on his table, then out the window at Clara, who had stopped swinging and was now picking flowers with the careful attention to detail that seemed to define her approach to everything important. Tom, I think. That's a conversation we need to have in person, when you're ready to hear whatever the answer might be. I'm ready now, Cole. I need to know. Cole closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Sarah's trust and Clara's future and Tom's fragile recovery all pressing down on him at once. The truth was like his father's gun, a tool that could protect or destroy, depending on how carefully it was wielded. Tom, there are some things we've discovered that suggest Clara's parentage might be more complicated than we originally thought. But those details need to be discussed carefully, with Dr. Martinez present to help you process the information. The silence on Tom's end of the line stretched long enough for Cole to wonder if the connection had been lost. When Tom finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of relief and resignation. It's you, isn't it? Clara is your daughter, not mine. The directness of the question left no room for evasion or gentle deflection. Cole looked at the envelope containing confirmation of what Tom had somehow intuited, and realized that the moment of truth had arrived, whether he was ready for it or not. I don't know for certain, Tom, but it's possible. The timing would fit, and Clara has been showing some resemblances that are hard to ignore. That night, 8 years ago, when I was helping my brother with his harvest, and Sarah was home alone, did something happen between you two? Cole's silence was answer enough. Tom's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the phone connection. I need to think about this, Cole. I need to figure out what this means for Clara, for my recovery, for everything I thought I knew about my family. Tom, whatever we discover about Clara's biology, it doesn't change the fact that you've been her father for 7 years. You're the one she thinks about when she hears the word daddy, the one she wants to come home to. But if she's your daughter, then she's a child who's lucky enough to have 2 men who love her and want what's best for her future. We'll figure out how to make that work, Tom, together. After ending the call, Cole finally opened the envelope. With hands that shook slightly, the test results were conclusive. Clara Elizabeth Morrison was his biological daughter, but as he stared at the scientific confirmation of what his heart had already known, Cole realized that the real challenge was just beginning. How do you tell a 7-year-old that her family is more complicated than she realized? How do you maintain a recovering alcoholic's progress while revealing that his beloved daughter isn't genetically his own? How do you honor the wishes of a deceased woman who had tried to protect everyone she loved from exactly this kind of painful truth? Clara's handmade sheriff's badge sat on Cole's kitchen counter, a paper star she'd colored with careful attention to detail and presented to him with shy pride the week before. It represented the innocent trust she'd placed in him to solve the problems that the other adults in her life couldn't handle. Now, Cole had to figure out how to be worthy of that trust while navigating the most complex case of his career, one where the right decision wasn't clear, where every choice carried the potential for both healing and harm, and where a child's happiness hung in the balance of choices made by adults who were still learning how to love her properly. The family photograph sat propped against the lamp. On Dr. Martinez's desk, three people who had chosen to become something unprecedented in Millfield's history. Cole stood on the left, his hand resting protectively on Clara's shoulder. Tom stood on the right, his recovered face showing the strength that came from surviving personal darkness. And Clara stood between them, beaming with the radiant happiness of a child who finally understood that love could take unexpected forms. "The judge has reviewed all the documentation," Dr. Martinez said, addressing the three adults gathered in her office, while Clara colored quietly in the corner, seemingly absorbed in creating a picture of the farmhouse she would soon be returning to. She's agreed to approve the shared custody arrangement, but she wants to interview Clara privately to ensure this solution truly serves her best interests. 3 months had passed since the day Cole had opened the paternity test results. 3 months of careful conversations and gradual revelations that had transformed a potentially devastating truth into the foundation for something entirely new. Tom's reaction to learning Clara wasn't his biological daughter had surprised everyone, including himself. "I always wondered why she seemed so much braver than me," he'd said during that first difficult conversation. "Now I understand. She got her courage from you, Cole. But she got her kindness and her loyalty from living with me and Sarah. She's the best of all of us." The shared custody arrangement they'd proposed was unusual but practical. Clara would live primarily with Tom on the farm that had been saved from foreclosure through Cole's intervention and some creative financing. But she would spend weekends and holidays with Cole, and both men would share responsibility for major decisions about her education, healthcare, and future. "Clara," Dr. Martinez said gently, "the judge would like to talk with you about your family situation. She wants to make sure you understand what's been decided and that you're happy with the arrangements." Clara looked up from her coloring with the serious expression she wore when adults asked her opinion about important matters. Will she ask me which daddy I like better? She might ask questions like that. What would you tell her? Clara considered. This with the gravity of someone far older than her, 8 years. "I'd tell her that asking me to choose between Daddy Tom and Daddy Cole would be like asking me to choose which arm I wanted to keep. They're both part of me now." Judge Patricia Henley had been presiding over family court cases for 15 years, but she'd never encountered a situation quite like the one documented in Clara Morrison's file. A biological father who hadn't known of his daughter's existence until recently, a non-biological father who had raised the child with unwavering devotion, and a little girl who seemed remarkably well-adjusted despite the complexity of her family structure. "Clara, do you understand why we're having this conversation today?" Judge Henley asked once they were alone in her chambers. "Because grown-ups want to make sure I'm being taken care of properly," Clara replied with the matter-of-fact tone she used for obvious questions. "But I already know I'm being taken care of properly. I have 2 daddies who love me and want me to be happy. Tell me about your relationship with both of your fathers." Clara's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Daddy Tom teaches me about farming and how to take care of animals. He makes the best pancakes in the world, and he reads me stories every night before bed. When I have nightmares about Mama being gone, he holds me until I feel better." "And what about Sheriff Hayes, your biological father?" "Daddy Cole teaches me about being brave and doing what's right even when it's scary. He shows me how to help people who are in trouble, and he always keeps his promises. When I was afraid about Daddy Tom being sick, Daddy Cole made sure I stayed safe until Daddy Tom got better." Judge Henley made notes on her legal pad, struck by the child's articulate explanation of her dual relationships. "Clara, some people might think it's confusing to have 2 fathers. Is it confusing for you?" Clara tilted her head, considering the question with characteristic seriousness. "It's not confusing at all. Daddy Tom taught me that families don't have to look like other people's families to be real families. And Daddy Cole taught me that sometimes the best solutions are the ones nobody's tried before." What do you think your mother would say about this arrangement? For the first time during the interview, Clara's composure wavered slightly. Mama always said that love was the most important thing in any family. She said as long as people loved each other and took care of each other, the details didn't matter as much as everyone thought they did. Judge Henley closed Clara's file, having heard everything she needed to make her decision. In 30 years of legal practice, she'd seen countless custody battles that focused on adult rights and legal precedents while losing sight of the children, whose futures hung in the balance. But this case was different. This was about three people who had found a way to put a child's needs above their own egos, who had chosen cooperation over conflict, who had proven that unconventional solutions could sometimes serve justice better than traditional approaches. Clara, I'm going to approve the arrangement your fathers have proposed. You'll continue living primarily with Tom on the farm, but you'll also spend regular time with Cole. Does that sound good to you? Clara's smile could have lit up the entire courthouse. It sounds perfect. Thank you for understanding that some families are just bigger than other families. As they walked back to Dr. Martinez's office, Clara slipped her hand into Judge Henley's with the casual trust that seemed to characterize all her interactions with adults. Judge Henley, can I tell you a secret? Of course, sweetheart. I think Mama planned this whole thing. I think she knew that someday I'd need both of my daddies, and she made sure I'd have them when I was ready to understand. 1 year later, Sarah's wedding dress hung in the closet of the farmhouse bedroom that had once belonged to Tom and Clara Morrison. The white silk had been carefully preserved in tissue paper, waiting for a future that Sarah would never see, but had somehow made possible through the choices she'd made and the love she'd shared. Clara, now 8 years old and taller by several inches, stood before her mother's vanity mirror, brushing her dark hair with the silver-backed brush that had belonged to 3 generations of women in Sarah's family. Her reflection showed a child who had grown into her features, displaying the perfect blend of strength and gentleness that had defined her mother's character. "Daddy Tom," she called out, her voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who knew she was loved and protected. "Is it time to go to the church picnic yet?" Tom appeared in the doorway, and the transformation in him over the past year was remarkable. His face had filled out again, his eyes were clear and bright, and his smile carried the genuine warmth of someone who had found his way back to joy. The year of sobriety, combined with the relief of understanding Clara's true parentage, had allowed him to rebuild his relationship with his daughter on a foundation of honesty rather than the confusion and guilt that had nearly destroyed them both. "Almost ready, sweetheart. Daddy Cole should be here any minute with the potato salad you two made yesterday." The ease with which Tom referred to Cole as Clara's other father spoke to the remarkable adjustment all 3 of them had made to their unconventional family structure. What could have been a source of ongoing tension had instead become a source of strength, with each man contributing his unique gifts to Clara's upbringing. Cole arrived precisely on time, as was his habit, carrying the covered dish and wearing the kind of genuine smile that had become more frequent over the past year. His relationship with Clara had deepened naturally, built on shared interests and the kind of easy companionship that seemed to validate their biological connection while never diminishing the bond she shared with Tom. "Ready for the Hayes family's debut at the annual church picnic?" Cole asked, his tone light but carrying an undertone of significance that both Clara and Tom understood. This would be the first public event where Clara would openly acknowledge both her fathers, where the unconventional family structure they'd created would be presented to the broader Millfield community for acceptance or judgment. "We've been ready for months," Clara said with characteristic directness. "Mrs. Henderson says people are going to ask lots of questions, but that we should just tell them the truth and let them figure out how they feel about it." The drive to the church took them past familiar landmarks. The courthouse where Cole had first heard Clara's desperate plea for help. The Henderson General Store where Martha had noticed Clara's needs weren't being met. The farm where 3 Lives had been transformed by the courage to embrace an unprecedented solution to an impossible situation. At the church, the annual picnic was already in full swing. Families spread across the lawn under ancient oak trees. Children ran between the tables with the joyful abandon that belonged uniquely to summer afternoons, and the air carried the mingled scents of home-cooked food and fresh-cut grass. Cole, Tom, and Clara approached the gathering as a unit, their easy interaction drawing curious glances from community members who had been speculating about the unusual arrangement for months. But it was Clara who took the initiative in introducing her family to anyone who asked. "These are both my daddies," she would explain, with the straightforward honesty that adults found both disarming and refreshing. "Daddy Tom raised me from when I was born, and Daddy Cole is my biological father. They both love me and take care of me, so I'm lucky enough to have two daddies instead of just one." Martha Henderson, now in her 70s but still possessed of the sharp eyes and practical wisdom that had guided so many families through difficult transitions, watched the interactions with obvious satisfaction. "That child has more emotional intelligence at 8 years old than most adults develop in a lifetime," she confided to Dr. Martinez, who had driven down from Billings specifically to attend the picnic and see how the family was adjusting to their new public status. "It's remarkable how well they've all adapted," Dr. Martinez agreed. "Tom's sobriety is solid. Cole has embraced fatherhood with the kind of dedication you'd expect from his character, and Clara has thrived under the dual attention." As the afternoon progressed, it became clear that the Millfield community was prepared to embrace the unusual family structure with the kind of practical acceptance that characterized small towns at their best. People asked questions, certainly, but the questions came from curiosity rather than judgment, and Clara's obvious happiness seemed to answer any doubts about whether the arrangement was truly serving her best interests. The turning point came during the traditional family photograph session, when the church photographer asked families to gather for portraits. Without hesitation, Clara positioned herself between Tom and Cole, her arms around both their waists, her smile radiant with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. "This is my family," she announced to anyone within hearing distance. "It might look different from other families, but it's perfect for us." Sarah's wedding dress, packed away in tissue paper, represented the choices she'd made and the future she'd tried to protect. But watching Clara laugh with both her fathers, secure in their love and confident in her place in the world, it was clear that Sarah's legacy lived on in ways she could never have imagined. 5 years later, 12-year-old Clara Morrison Hayes stood at the kitchen window of the farmhouse, watching the sunrise paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and amber that seemed to promise infinite possibilities. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders now, and her height suggested she would indeed grow tall like her biological grandfather, just as Sarah had predicted. Cole found her there as he did most mornings, having developed the habit of stopping by the farm before beginning his rounds as sheriff. The arrangement that had once seemed so complicated had evolved into something beautifully natural, a rhythm of shared responsibility that allowed Clara to benefit from both men's strengths while maintaining the stability of her childhood home. "Deep in thoughts for such an early hour," Cole observed, accepting the cup of coffee Clara poured for him with the practiced ease of someone who'd been helping with adult responsibilities since she was small. "I was thinking about Mama," Clara said, her voice carrying the thoughtful quality that had replaced the solemn gravity of her younger years. "About how she somehow knew we'd all find our way to exactly where we needed to be." Tom emerged from the barn, his steps steady and his face weathered by years of honest work and clear conscience. The farm had prospered under his renewed attention, growing from a struggling operation into something that could genuinely support Clara's future education and dreams. More importantly, Tom had grown into the father Sarah had always believed. He could be patient, wise, and secure in his role despite the unconventional circumstances. "Morning, Cole," Tom said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had long ago stopped feeling awkward about their arrangement. "Clara's been up since 5, making plans for her birthday party. Next week. 13 years old," Cole mused, studying Clara's face for signs of the teenager she was becoming. "I remember when you were 7 and afraid your daddy might not come home from the hospital." Clara moved to stand between both men's chairs, her hands resting naturally on their shoulders in a gesture that had become characteristic of their family interactions. "I've been thinking about something, and I want both of you to hear it at the same time." Both men gave her their full attention, recognizing the tone that meant Clara had been processing something important and was ready to share. Her conclusions. "I want to legally change my name to Clara Morrison Hayes," she said, with the quiet determination that reminded Cole so strongly of Sarah. "Not because I'm choosing one of you over the other, but because I want my name to reflect who I really am, someone who belongs to both of you equally." Cole felt his throat tighten with emotion. Over the years, he'd watched Clara navigate the complexities of her situation with remarkable grace, but this request represented something deeper than practical considerations. It was her way of officially claiming both her heritage and her chosen family, of declaring to the world that love came in many forms and all of them were valid. Tom nodded slowly, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think that's exactly what your mama would have wanted, sweetheart. She always said families were about choosing to love each other, not about following rules other people made up." The morning routine continued around them. Breakfast prepared and shared, responsibilities discussed and distributed, plans made for the day ahead. But underneath the ordinary details of family life ran the deeper current of gratitude for the path they'd all traveled together. Clara had grown into the strong, confident young woman Sarah had envisioned, but she'd done so with the support of 2 fathers who had learned to put her needs above their own egos. Tom had found his way back from the darkness of grief and addiction, discovering that love multiplied rather than diminished when it was shared. And Cole had finally understood that being a father wasn't about biology or legal rights. It was about showing up consistently, offering guidance without control, and loving someone enough to help them become themselves, rather than trying to shape them into your own image. After Clara left for school and Tom headed out to check on the cattle, Cole found himself in Sarah's old sewing room, now converted into Clara's study space. The walls were covered with her artwork, her academic achievements, and photographs that told the story of a family that had chosen to define itself by love rather than convention. But it was Clara's handmade sheriff's badge that still occupied a place of honor on her desk. That paper star she'd colored so carefully years ago, faded now, but preserved like a talisman. Next to it sat a newer creation, a drawing she'd made of the 3 of them standing together on the farm, with Sarah's spirit watching over them from a sky filled with protective stars. Cole remembered the night Clara had first run to him for help, terrified and desperate, seeking protection from the chaos her young life had become. He'd expected to offer temporary assistance, to help a neighbor's child through a family crisis, before returning to the quiet routine of his bachelor existence. Instead, he discovered that the most important cases weren't solved with handcuffs and legal proceedings, but with patience and wisdom and the courage to love unconditionally. Clara hadn't just needed rescuing that night. She'd needed adults who were brave enough to rewrite the rules about what families could look like. The town of Millfield had grown accustomed to their unusual arrangement, and some families had even begun to explore more flexible approaches to custody and care when traditional structures weren't serving children's best interests. Clara's story had become part of the community's folklore, a reminder that sometimes the best solutions were the ones nobody had thought to try before. As Cole prepared to begin his daily rounds, he paused at the kitchen window where he'd found Clara that morning, The sunrise had given way to full daylight, illuminating the farmland that stretched toward the mountains like a promise of endless possibility. Clara Morrison Hayes would grow up knowing she was loved by two fathers who had chosen to put her happiness above their own pride. She would understand that families came in many forms, all of them valid as long as they were built on foundations of respect and care. And she would carry forward Sarah's legacy of believing that love could overcome any obstacle, solve any problem, heal any wound that wasn't too deep to reach. In the distance, Cole could see Clara walking toward the school bus stop, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her head held high with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged in the world. She turned to wave at the farmhouse before climbing aboard the bus, and Cole found himself thinking that Sarah would have been proud of the young woman her daughter was becoming. The paper sheriff's badge Clara had made for him years ago might have faded, but the trust it represented remained as strong as ever. Some promises, Cole had learned, were too important to be contained by conventional thinking. Some families were too precious to be defined by traditional rules, and some children were wise enough to teach the adults in their lives that love, in all its forms, was always worth fighting for.